Now we all know that Anki is spaced repetition software, which means we're going to get the greatest benefit from it if we use it as intended, as a tool for spacing out our review of different cards based on how well we're performing against them. But this is med school, and reality is that at some point we're going to want to enter cram mode to select down to a few cards that we know we want to rehearse prior to going into an exam. And Anki has that functionality built in, and they're filtered decks. So we'll have a look today at filtered decks, how you can create them and how they work, because it's not intuitive. One of the things I've done when I've been going through and creating my cards is to tag some of them with the term key equations. So I've done that because I know that these are cards that involve a formula or are formulaic in some way, and that I expect they're likely to come up on an exam, and I want to be able to review those quickly. So I've selected those cards in my browse window, and you'll see I'll just select the text here from this because I'm going to go into the deck listing and along to the tools and create a filtered deck. You'll see by default it's going to create a filtered deck which relates to the deck that I currently have selected in the filter list, which is useless because I could just study the demo deck if I wanted to. So I'm going to paste over that selection with the tag that I actually want to pull cards for. And I'm going to select a limit of cards. The default 100 is fine. Just a quick note, on an earlier video I said you could add select option groups for filtered decks. That's not the case. You can actually set the limit of the number of cards that you'll see in a filtered deck right here when you create it. Another key selection is what order you want to see the cards. So do you want to see the oldest first? Do you want to see them in random order, and so on? I usually select random, and the other options are to reschedule cards based on the answers in your deck. So if you uncheck this, it's not going to remember how well you did on the cards while you were studying them from the filtered deck. And most of the time you actually do want it to remember how well you did on the cards, so you leave that selected. If you want to include custom steps, so in other words, when you're presented with the answer to the card, those options along the bottom, the first one being if you need to see it again, that'll be in 1 minute. If you thought you did good on it but you want to see it again in the session, then that will show you in 10 minutes. You can change those, but otherwise you're wanting to build your deck. And so it's created my filtered deck for me, which I can go straight into studying. But I'll go back and just have a look at some of the options we now have for that deck that we've created and tell you what it's done in the background. So we can rename that deck. We could export it if we wanted to. So we've got a set of cards that meet some criteria that we want to share with someone else, and we can delete it. Or in this case, deletion means something a little different to what it does if you delete a standard deck. Why is that? It's because what Anki's done is it's found the cards that meet the criteria you told it to, and it's pulled cards from each of the decks that you have elsewhere in your list into this filtered deck temporarily. So when I'm studying the cards, if I decide that the card was easy, it's actually going to remove it from the filter deck and put it back into where it originally was. And what that means is that if I decide to delete the filtered deck, it won't actually delete all of the cards underneath it. Instead, what it'll do is send all of those cards back to where they came from. Another thing with filtered decks is that, say you've studied and you've gone through half of them, but you come back the next day and you actually want to start from scratch again with that filtered deck. What you can do is go back into the options and click Rebuild. That'll pull all of the cards, regardless of whether they've been studied, back into that filtered deck. So it gives you quite a bit of flexibility about how you go about cramming. The other key thing to note, if I go back into options, is that your deck is being created based on a search term. So that content that we covered in the prior clip about being efficient at searching in Anki applies to creating filtered decks as well. So go back and have a look at that clip if you want to become more familiar with how you set up search terms in Anki. And that clip also has a link to the documentation on Anki SRS website for all of the different search terms that you can use.